My name is Chelsea Morgan. I am 35 years old, and an hour ago my parents were still laughing at me in the middle of my younger sister's wedding reception because I told them my fiancé was coming. They did not laugh quietly either. They did it in front of relatives, in front of people from my sister's new family, in front of guests who turned to look at me with that careful expression people use when they think a woman is either lying or unraveling in public. My mother had already spent most of the night correcting the truth every time it came out of my mouth, and my father had gone even further, acting as if the only reason I would say a man was on his way was because I could not stand watching my younger sister get married before me. I stood there and let them do it, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had finally learned that some people will only believe the truth when it walks through the door and looks them in the eye. That was the part they did not understand. They thought I was embarrassed. They thought I was cornered. What they did not know was that by the time they started making me the joke of the evening, I had already stopped trying to defend myself. I had heard enough. I had seen enough. And I had sent one message that changed the direction of the night. A few minutes later, the room shifted. The noise outside the building caught everyone's attention, and the same people who had been smiling at my humiliation started looking toward the entrance instead. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The pattern started long before tonight. I grew up in a house where approval was measured by how well one of us made my parents look to other people. I was the older daughter, which sounded important on paper, but in practice, it meant I was the trial run, the child they corrected in public and discussed in private. By the time I understood the difference between being loved and being displayed, I already knew which version of family mattered more in our house. My younger sister, Audrey Morgan, was easier for them. She smiled at the right moments, called home at predictable hours, chose a life my parents could explain in one sentence, and had the kind of warmth that made strangers feel included within minutes. None of that was fake. Audrey really was easy to like. That was part of the problem. She fit so naturally inside the story my parents wanted to tell about themselves that they never had to force anything around her. With me, everything felt like friction. I left Chicago for school, stayed away for work, and built a life my parents could summarize only by flattening it into something smaller than it was. My father, Thomas Morgan, respected things that sounded solid in conversation. He understood property, titles, memberships, and jobs, with names that impressed people over dinner. If he could not picture a person's work in a clean line, he assumed it was unstable. My mother, Diane Morgan, was more polished and harder to confront. She almost never said anything openly cruel when other people could hear her, but she had a way of softening the truth until it no longer belonged to you. She could turn a promotion into a phase, a relationship into a complication, and a private success into a rumor that needed gentle handling. If my father dismissed me with certainty, my mother reduced me with manners. For years, I kept thinking I could fix that by bringing them better evidence. When I was in my 20s, I tried facts. I explained my work, sent photos from places they would never visit, and called after big meetings because I still believed parents were supposed to care when their daughter built something difficult on her own. The calls always ended the same way. My father would lose interest the moment the details became technical, and my mother would drift into stories about Audrey's latest milestone as if the conversation had corrected itself. I could say I had spent months closing a deal that changed my career, and somehow the subject would turn to wedding registries, kitchen renovations, or a neighbor's son with a safer job title. After a while, I stopped offering them the important parts first. That was not secrecy. It was self-preservation. The less access they had to what mattered to me, the less material they had to reshape. Even then, they found ways to do it. If I came home for holidays, I was introduced as the daughter who was still figuring things out. If I sent gifts, my mother thanked me and then told people I was compensating for not visiting enough. If I missed a family event because of work, my father said I liked to make myself sound busier than I was. Every version of me they offered to other people had one thing in common. It was always smaller than the truth. My aunt, Patricia Cole, made it worse because she treated gossip like a form of service. She was my mother's younger sister and her most loyal audience, the person who took every private frustration and polished it into a story worth repeating. Patricia never needed proof. She only needed a tone that suggested concern. If she said something softly enough, people accepted it as care instead of cruelty. My best friend, Jillian Hart, was the one who kept telling me I was not imagining the pattern. She had known me since college, long before I had money, status, or any reason to protect my reputation outside my work. Jillian also knew about Daniel Mercer before anyone in my family did. Daniel was not a fantasy, not a convenient name, and not a last-minute invention to survive my sister's wedding season. He was the one part of my life I had protected on purpose, because by then I understood exactly what my parents did with things they could not control. When I told them I was engaged, there was no joy on the other end of the call. There was a pause, then a question, then another question, and behind both of them was the same cold assumption. If Audrey was getting married first, I must be trying to correct the optics. That was when I stopped explaining. By the time I walked into that loft tonight, they had already decided who I was, and I had already learned how little truth mattered once they liked their version better. By the time dinner service started, the room had settled into the kind of polished noise that makes cruelty easier to hide. The loft looked expensive in a modern way, all exposed brick, black steel, candlelight, and long banquet tables arranged to suggest warmth without ever becoming intimate. People moved through the space with drinks in their hands and practiced smiles on their faces, and I had already learned that night that humiliation does not always arrive with a raised voice. Sometimes it comes dressed as concern, as a stranger tilting their head and asking a question they think is harmless because someone else has already prepared the answer for them. I had barely finished one conversation before another guest asked whether my fiancé had been delayed, and before I could say a word, my mother stepped in and said, "Travel had always been complicated for me." She said it lightly, as if she were saving me from embarrassment, but I could feel the trap inside the sentence. My father made it worse by adding that I had always liked dramatic timing, sharp enough to shift the burden onto me if I reacted. I let them build the version of me they preferred, the daughter with unstable stories, the older sister who could not accept the attention moving elsewhere, the woman who needed an audience more than she needed the truth. By then, I knew better than to argue with people who had spent years rehearsing my role for me. I took a glass of water from a passing server and stepped away from the reception floor before my face gave anything away. Near the back of the venue, the glamour thinned out. The polished concrete floor gave way to a narrower service corridor that ran past the catering station and the freight elevator, and the music from the reception faded into a dull pulse behind the walls. I stopped there because I needed 30 seconds of quiet and because habit still told me not to make a scene. Then I heard my mother's voice before I saw her. She was around the corner near a stack of rental crates, speaking in the lower tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. Patricia was with her, and my father was close enough that I could hear the impatience in his breathing even when he was not speaking. I stayed still and listened. My mother was saying that I had left them no choice because once I started making claims like this, the kindest thing a family could do was manage expectations before I embarrassed myself further. Patricia agreed in the eager way she used when she was about to make something uglier. She said everyone had noticed the pattern with me, that I disappeared for months, came back with polished stories, and expected people to accept them without proof. My father said the real issue was timing. If I had actually been engaged, he said, any decent man would have shown up long before Audrey's wedding day, instead of turning my sister's reception into a stage for one more performance. He said it with such certainty that for a second I understood how long they had been telling themselves this version in private. They had not simply doubted me. They had organized me into a cautionary tale. What changed in that corridor was not my opinion of them. That had been fraying for years. What changed was the last piece of false hope I had carried into the building. Until then, some private part of me still wanted to believe they were careless rather than deliberate. But what I heard in those voices was not confusion, it was strategy. They had been preparing the room before I even arrived. They had framed me in advance so that anything I said would sound defensive or unstable. I looked down at my phone and felt something inside me go very still. I opened my messages and found Daniel's name. He was already in Chicago. He had been delayed by a meeting that ran longer than expected. Standing in that corridor with my family a few feet away, I understood that there was nothing left to settle. I typed 4 words and sent them before I could rethink the timing. Come now. Use the front. I slipped the phone back into my bag and walked toward the reception without making a sound. No one noticed where I had been. No one asked why my expression had changed. The room was still moving in the same rhythm. Glasses lifting, silverware striking plates, conversations weaving around the bride and groom as if the night were proceeding normally. My mother caught sight of me near the dance floor and smiled the way women smile when they think control has returned to them. My father had already turned to another guest. Patricia was telling some carefully edited story to a couple from the groom's side. They all looked comfortable again. That was the detail I noticed most. I did not go back to defend myself. I stayed where I could see the entrance and let the next few minutes belong to them while they still could. A few minutes later, the sound reached the windows before it reached the room. It was not loud enough to stop the band, but it was different from the traffic below and sharp enough to pull heads toward the glass. Guests near the bar turned first, then the reaction spread table by table in the quiet ripple that moves through any formal event when something unplanned enters the edge of the frame. I stayed exactly where I was. I did not step closer to the entrance, and I did not need to. The service door near the freight lift opened a moment later. One of the venue managers hurried through, and then Daniel Mercer walked in as if the timing belonged to him and not to the room that had been laughing at me 10 minutes earlier. He was wearing a dark overcoat over a tailored suit, carrying no visible rush with him, and the first thing he did was look straight at me. Not around me, not through the room. At me. That was what changed the air faster than anything else. People can argue with a rumor. They cannot argue with recognition. He crossed the floor without hesitation, and the crowd parted for him in the small, instinctive way people move around someone who seems fully certain of where he is going. When he reached me, he took my hand, leaned close enough that only those nearest could hear him, and said, "I'm here." He kissed my cheek, then looked at the ring on my hand as if he were confirming something private and ordinary instead of detonating the lie my parents had spent the evening polishing. My mother froze first. Her expression did not collapse all at once. It tightened, then stalled, as if her face had not yet received instructions for this version of reality. My father recovered faster, but only because he had spent his whole life adjusting his tone to power the moment he recognized it. He started toward us with a smile that arrived too late to look sincere. Patricia followed half a step behind, trying to shape confusion into social grace. Daniel greeted none of them before he finished speaking to me. That detail mattered more than anything expensive he might have worn. It told the room our relationship was not there to be verified by my family. It existed with or without their approval. By the time my father reached us, the guests nearest the dance floor had stopped pretending not to watch. Thomas introduced himself in the false tone of a man meeting an important connection rather than the fiancé he had spent the night dismissing. Daniel shook his hand once, briefly, and gave my mother the same measured courtesy. He never overplayed the moment. He did not embarrass them with theatrics. He did something worse. He treated them like people whose opinions had no effect on what was already true. That was when the room shifted against them. The bride's side, which had been so willing to accept the story of me as a problem, suddenly developed the caution people get when they suspect they have been standing too close to a lie. My mother tried to regain control by saying she wished everyone could finally relax now that there had been such a misunderstanding. Daniel turned to her with the calm expression of a man who knew exactly how much damage a sentence like that was meant to erase. He said there had been no misunderstanding on my end. Then he added, almost casually, that he had wanted to be there sooner, but had been on a call finalizing a closing that Chelsea had led from Chicago. Not supported, not observed. Led. My father's eyes moved to me then, not warmly, not proudly, but with the first real calculation of the evening. He understood status language. He understood what it meant when one capable adult publicly attributed authority to another in a room full of witnesses. Audrey saw it too. She was still smiling for photographs because brides are trained to survive almost anything for the camera, but I caught the flicker in her face when she realized the attention in the loft had tilted away from her. I did not enjoy that part. Whatever else Audrey was, this was still her reception. But she had spent months standing inside our parents' version of me without objecting once, and silence has a cost when it keeps choosing the wrong side. A member of the groom's family approached Daniel, recognizing his name from business rather than from me, and that was the moment my father understood the problem had become larger than a family embarrassment. It was now a social correction taking place in public, in real time, among people whose opinions he actually valued. My mother touched my arm then, reclaiming me by reflex, and said she was so relieved everything had worked out after all. I looked at her hand until she removed it. I said nothing. I did not have to. The room was finally doing the listening for me. What happened next would have been almost funny if it had not cost me so much already. Within minutes of Daniel's arrival, my parents began performing a version of support they had never once offered in private. My mother started telling people she had always known I would surprise them all in the end. My father moved between guests with the restless energy of a man trying to reverse a narrative before it settled into memory. He wanted proximity to Daniel, context for me, and enough witnesses to make it look as if the entire family had simply been caught in an awkward delay. I would have left him to the effort if Jillian had not touched my wrist near the edge of the dance floor and asked me to step aside. She looked angry in the contained, efficient way that usually meant she had a fact and not a feeling. We moved toward a quieter corner near the coat check where the music turned to bass, and the crowd thinned just enough for a serious voice. Jillian told me she had spent part of cocktail hour speaking to a woman from the groom's side who served on the advisory board of a downtown nonprofit. Then the woman mentioned my name again after Daniel arrived, not because of the engagement, but because she suddenly remembered hearing concerns about me last fall when I had been under consideration for a leadership appointment connected to a civic redevelopment fund. I knew the position immediately. It would not have changed my title, but it would have put me in front of decision-makers I had been trying to reach for 2 years. I had interviewed well, submitted every document on time, and been told I was one of the strongest candidates before the process went silent. The explanation I got later was careful. They had gone with someone who seemed like a safer fit for the board. Jillian said the woman remembered why my name had become complicated. Someone connected to my family had contacted a board member privately and framed it as concern. They said I was talented but unstable under pressure, that I had a habit of exaggerating achievements, and that there had been confusion within the family about whether parts of my personal life were even real. The language was polished enough to sound responsible, vague enough to avoid obvious liability, and vicious enough to do exactly what it was designed to do. I asked who made the call. She said the woman had not known then, only that the warning came through a mutual social contact from my mother's side of the family and had been repeated inside the review process before anyone thought to question the motive. Patricia. The name landed before Jillian finished the sentence. It fit too cleanly not to be true. She had access, appetite, and exactly the kind of intimate nastiness that presents itself as protective concern. My mother would have fed it. My father would have dismissed it as unfortunate gossip after the fact, and I would have been the one left wondering why a strong opportunity had vanished into polite silence. Daniel joined us a minute later, reading my face before either of us spoke. Jillian gave him the short version. He asked which board, what contact, and whether the woman would repeat the account if needed. Jillian said yes, not publicly yet, but in the right setting she would confirm what she remembered. That was enough for me. I suddenly saw the pattern with sharper edges. My parents had not only minimized my successes because they disliked what they represented. At least once, and probably more than once, someone close to them had reached beyond the family and tampered with the conditions around my work. The lie had crossed a line. It was no longer a private insult. It had entered the part of adult life where reputations affect contracts, appointments, and who gets trusted in rooms where opportunities are decided before they are announced. I looked back across the loft. My mother was laughing too brightly with two women she had frozen out an hour earlier. My father was speaking to Daniel's acquaintance, as if he had known about that connection all along. Patricia was near the dessert table, rearranging her mouth into an expression of mature calm. None of them looked frightened. Not yet. That was when I understood that if I confronted them in the middle of the reception, they would reduce the whole thing to emotion. I was not going to give them that chance. I told Jillian to get the woman's number before the night ended. I asked Daniel for one thing only: discretion, until I decided where I wanted the line drawn. He nodded once. Then I put my glass down, returned to the reception floor, and let my parents continue performing relief for a crowd that still had no idea how much more expensive their version of me was about to become. They started calling before noon the next day. My mother left the first voicemail in a trembling tone meant to suggest heartbreak instead of strategy. My father followed with a text that skipped over the wedding almost entirely and asked whether Daniel might be willing to join them for dinner later that week. I ignored both. By Monday afternoon, I had no interest in hearing fresh lies in a familiar house, so I moved the conversation to a place where every word would have to survive a table, a clock, and other people's memory. Daniel arranged the room through counsel he used for business disputes, a private conference suite on the upper floor of a law office downtown, with glass walls, a long walnut table, and exactly none of the softness my mother depended on when she wanted to turn consequences into family pain. When my parents arrived, they looked offended by the setting before they looked worried by it. My mother had dressed as if presentation could still soften outcome. My father carried the brittle self-control of a man who had not yet decided whether this was an overreaction or a threat. Daniel was already seated when they came in, not at the head of the table but beside me, which mattered. This was my meeting. He was there because the truth had now touched his life too. My mother tried tears first. She said the wedding had become a misunderstanding, that emotions had been high, that I had taken certain remarks more harshly than they were intended. I let her finish because interruptions would only help her later. Then I handed a folder across the table to my father and told him to open it. Inside were notes from the board process Jillian had traced, a summary of the advisory contact's recollection, dates from the selection window, and a memorandum from counsel explaining what happens when false statements from family contacts contaminate a professional review process. I did not accuse them of crimes they had not technically committed. I did something more effective. I described cause, contact, and damage in plain sequence until the room stopped feeling like family altogether. My father read in silence longer than I expected. My mother tried to break in twice with the same defense, that Patricia had only ever been worried about me. I told her worry does not reach into civic appointments. Worry does not whisper instability into professional circles. Worry does not make another adult woman sound unsafe because her private life has not been adequately validated by her parents. My father asked whether I could actually prove Patricia made the contact. I told him proof develops quickly once people understand there may be liability attached to their memory. The board member remembered enough. The intermediary social contact could be identified. Patricia had the habit, the access, and the motive. And whether they had instructed her or simply fed the story until she felt entitled to act on it no longer mattered to me in any emotional sense. It mattered only as a question of exposure. My mother changed tactics then. She said families say careless things, families get things wrong, families recover. That was the first moment I interrupted her. I told her that what she called family had become a delivery system for damage. I told her I was done offering my life to people who turned private knowledge into public leverage the moment it suited them. Then I laid out the boundary in terms too clear to misunderstand. There would be no visits, no holidays, no casual calls, no updates through Audrey, no stories passed through Patricia, no reaching out to my colleagues, no using Daniel's name to repair their standing with anyone who had watched them humiliate me. Counsel would send formal notice if any of those lines were crossed. My father looked up then and asked whether I was really prepared to cut off my own parents over one ugly season. I told him it was not one season. It was the first season in which I had finally documented the weather correctly. My mother started crying for real after that, not because she had found remorse, but because she finally understood there would be no path back through performance. She asked whether there was anything they could do. I said yes. They could correct the false impression they had spread wherever they had spread it, beginning with Patricia and anyone connected to that board process. They could make no request in return. They could expect no meeting after. This was not reconciliation. It was cleanup. When the silence settled, my father closed the folder and looked older than he had at the wedding. He asked if Audrey knew. I said enough. Then I stood, gathered my papers, and ended the meeting before my mother could turn one more sentence into a plea for access she had already lost. A week later, the correction began, and it looked nothing like forgiveness. My parents did what people like them always do when pressure finally reaches the places they care about most. They moved fast, quietly, and only where it counted. My mother called women she had spent years feeding stories to and told them there had been damaging misunderstandings about me that should never have been repeated. My father reached out to the civic contacts he respected and clarified that private family speculation had crossed into territory it never should have touched. Patricia was the one who resisted, which made her the easiest to expose. Once counsel sent notice and the board contact confirmed that a family-connected warning had influenced the selection process around my name, Patricia lost the protection of ambiguity. She was no longer the amusing aunt with loose boundaries. She was the relative who had interfered in a professional appointment because she preferred gossip to truth. The social fallout was immediate. Not dramatic in the way television imagines consequences, but real in the way adult life actually works. Invitations cooled, calls stopped. A volunteer committee removed her from an event she had chaired for years. 2 women who had repeated her stories distanced themselves the moment the risk attached to her became visible. My mother tried to frame that collapse as tragedy. I saw it as overdue alignment. Audrey reached out once. She did not defend our parents, not directly. She said the family was in pieces, that everyone was embarrassed, that maybe time would create a less final version of what had happened. I read the message twice and answered with more restraint than she deserved. I told her embarrassment was not the injury. Exposure was not the cruelty. What had broken this family was not my refusal to keep absorbing the damage. It was the damage itself, repeated for so long that everyone had started calling it personality. She never wrote back, and I did not chase her. That was another lesson I learned too late. Silence is not neutrality when it consistently protects the people doing the harm. Daniel never asked me to soften any of it. He did the opposite. He respected the line once I drew it. The locks were changed on the condo my parents still had access to from years earlier. Their numbers were blocked. Their emails were filtered into a folder my attorney could review if necessary. Holiday plans were remade without consultation. Information stopped moving in their direction. There was no final dinner, no last Christmas, no fragile attempt to see whether a smaller version of them might be safe enough to keep. I had spent too much of my life confusing endurance with virtue. Distance felt colder for exactly 2 days. After that, it felt accurate. The last thing I received from my father was a short note, stripped of pride and almost stripped of language. He said he had not understood how much they had diminished me because in his mind, I had always remained within reach, still close enough to be corrected. That sentence told me more than an apology ever could. He had never been reacting to who I was. He had been reacting to the fact that I had become someone he could no longer define. I did not respond. Some truths do not need a conversation once they have finally shown their face. A month after the wedding, the board that had once passed on me reopened the door in a limited but real way, not as a gift, not out of pity, because once the interference was named, my record stood on its own again. I accepted the meeting on my terms and walked into it without carrying my family in with me. I used to think closure required agreement, some version both sides could survive. It does not. Sometimes closure is naming what happened, locking the door behind it, and refusing to make pain easier for the people who caused it. That was the real ending, not the wedding, not the conference room, not the collapse of Patricia's standing. The real ending was this. They lost access to me, and I stopped needing them to understand why. If there is anything worth taking from my story, it is this. Blood can explain a connection, but it cannot excuse sabotage. Family can share your name and still refuse to honor your life. And sometimes the healthiest thing a daughter can do is stop offering her truth to people who only know how to cut it down until it fits their comfort. Thank you for staying with me through this. If this story made you think about your own boundaries, I hope you remember that love without respect is only control wearing softer clothes. And if you have ever had to choose peace over permission, you already know why I walked away and never looked back.